Hi. The speaker sessions for the Cybersecurity Festival, we're really excited about bringing Stanford's most deepest thought leaders to share some ideas around how Stanford and our community can really better defend the human. I am Elizabeth Shee Lee, Senior Privacy Officer, and on behalf of Stanford University's University Privacy Office, I'd like to welcome you guys to our event, and this is going to be covering our consumer privacy session. For those of you, there's a mix of you here today, so it's mostly staff, faculty, students here in person, and we also have an online stream with Stanford through the online portal. And it is my privilege to invite our preeminent scholar and faculty, Dr. Jennifer King. She's the Director of Consumer Privacy for our Stanford Law School, and it's under the Center for Internet Society. So Dr. King, thanks so much for joining me today to talk about how we can better defend the human through consumer privacy strategies. And I'd like to start off with some questions about the California Consumer Protection Act and what does it mean for consumers here in California as well as beyond?
Sure. So thank you guys all for being here. So that law goes into effect in January 2020. It was
January 21.
2020, actually. Yeah, 2020. So coming up soon, although I believe it may not be enforced until July 1st. So businesses have about 6 months to kind of ease into it.
Mm-hmm.
So that law was originally a ballot initiative that was converted to a law at the last minute, literally, back in June. And that law provides California consumers with a few new rights. I'm going to read them off rather than try to memorize them. First, it's the right to notice, meaning that you'll be able to learn what companies are collecting about you. The right to access that data, so request a copy of it. The right to essentially opt out of further collection, so to tell them, I want you to stop collecting my data, and then the right to request that they delete your data. And then finally, they can't discriminate against you in price or any other way if you access those rights, if you exert those rights. So this is unlike anything else we have in the US. Some people compare it to the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, the GDPR. It's not really like the GDPR in form or function.
I thought it was modeled after it.
Yeah.
No, it actually really wasn't. So the consumer group that formed to pass that law really, they were working on it while the GDPR was in the process of being worked through. The GDPR is a result of, I think, like five or 6 years of deliberation in the EU. And CCPA is much narrower than the GDPR. That said, it's going to give California consumers rights that don't exist anywhere in the US. And so there's been a lot of confusion about the law. There's been a lot of scrambling by businesses to sort through exactly what it means for them and how they will comply with it. But for you as consumers, you probably won't notice anything necessarily that different day to day, but the companies are supposed to give you a way to learn about the access itself. So if it's a website, there's going to be a link. There potentially is going to be a button that the California Attorney General creates that will be a do not delete my data button that you can look for, or like an icon essentially. So they're supposed to communicate this to California consumers, and there will be a process by which you can actually exert these rights. Probably a form you have to fill out. But there's been a lot of tussling over a lot of the terms in the bill, and really one of the biggest differences between what the ballot initiative was trying to do and what the actual law that was passed in the legislature ended up doing was the ballot initiative gave us all a private right to action, meaning that you could sue companies or you could form a class action lawsuit and try to sue them to remedy if they don't conform with the law. And that was removed in the bill that was passed by the legislature. So we don't have the private right to action. The Attorney General's office basically has to administer complaints about the law, which they're not particularly happy about because they weren't promised any additional funding to oversee this at all, which has not made them happy. So that has been one of the biggest sources of kind of argument post-passage of the bill. And there were a series of amendments that were put forth during the last session to try to add clarifications and potentially get that private right to action back in, and it didn't succeed. So actually, for the most part, other than a few, I think, clarifications that everybody agreed were necessary, nothing was really added substantively to the bill.
So it's
the law
toothless.
has no teeth, basically.
It's not that it doesn't have teeth, but certainly there are a lot of people who would argue that as a consumer, the most powerful thing we can do is collectively sue a company, or individually, but collectively gather together and sue when we feel like they've been systematically exploiting our data. And that is, of course, the one thing that we're not able to do. So I think you may see, once the bill goes into effect, there might be more pushback from consumers trying to get legislators to actually add that back into the bill. But for this session, it didn't happen. So anything that happens in the future would need to be a new law, or potentially, I don't know if you could do an amendment, it might be a new law.
So is there any penalty for a company not to comply?
There are penalties. I do not remember the dollar amounts off the top of my head, but
It's not 5% of global revenues.
right, it is not. It does not have
Yeah.
the financial impact that the GDPR has.
Right. Is there anything significant to these? No.
Yeah, that's a good question. A good segue into that kind of our second question, which is, at Stanford here, we're a nonprofit, so technically we don't fall under the law. It's focused on for-profit companies.
Yeah.
But from your perspective with like CCPA, focusing on for-profit, is there any way that this may impact or interact with Stanford?
I guess it would probably the core campus node would depend on, let's say you're a professor and you spin off a company, for example, and you potentially use data that you collected in the context of work here. I'm not sure exactly how.
So maybe like some clinical research data
Potentially.
that's identified. Okay.
Yeah.
Or big data sets.
But in terms of compliance and penalties, we don't have, the California DOJ or the Attorney General doesn't have the kind of fining power, obviously, that even the FTC has. So in terms of the remedies consumers have and the penalties that businesses will suffer, it's really more dependent on individuals, mass numbers of individuals potentially making those claims against the companies individually. But in terms of Stanford, again, probably not much impact.
Excuse me, wait a second.
Yeah.
Didn't you just say that there's no private right of action?
There is not, right?
So if this guy and I got together and we went after Facebook, they would say, forget it, you guys.
No, not necessarily. I mean, if Facebook did not, let's say you put in a deletion request and they refused to delete your data or they never responded, you can then complain to the Attorney General's office.
Who
And
has
they-
no resources to do it.
Fair enough, yes. So we'll see how they are able to arbitrate those claims, but they are supposed to basically be the gatekeeper of individuals' claims and be able to, I don't know if they can force the company to respond or if they can penalize the company to respond. I'm honestly not sure off the top of my head, but essentially, your recourse, instead of being able to sue, is to complain to the Attorney General, who basically puts the company on notice that they have to comply. But whether that follows with a specific penalty, I don't actually know off the top of my head.
So this goes back to what's happening in the US, which is corporations have worked out how to defeat the law. And one thing the political establishment has done is to take away resources from all enforcement agencies, from court systems.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go to them, they cannot enforce it. You don't have inspectors, for example, for FDA or,
Right.
food agricultural inspections, things like that. So basically, I think the law is just really simply, kind of a sham.
Mhm.
If you don't have,
If it's
resources
toothless-
for
If it's
enforcement,
toothless, it's toothless.
it's toothless,
Right.
right?
Well, I think the companies are taking it seriously in terms of
But what it
figuring out how
does
to
is,
comply.
it creates opportunity for consultants to generate revenue by telling every small business to comply. So this is where it is. The second thing is the non-profit aspect troubles me,
Mhm.
because what these big companies could do, they could create non-profits and say, this is our non-profit. And that non-profit then trades with data. And I know of enough non-profits, the companies that I donate money to, non-profits, they sell my data. Because when I
Yes.
donate to one, then I suddenly start getting requests for money from 50 organizations.
Right. That is a loophole that concerns me, and it concerns me not just with nonprofits, but actually political organizations. Because I do think that is a gaping hole, not just with California, but nationwide in terms of thinking about the whole political structure and the fact that our political parties are very entrenched in that information gathering ecosystem as well. So I think the points you're raising is we look towards a federal law. Because the one thing that the CCPA is doing, and I do agree with you on a lot of the points you're making, it's definitely sparked conversation at very high levels across the nation, in the sense that companies, especially companies that do business in California and outside of California, everybody's afraid of other states passing similar laws and being in the position of the way we are today with security breach notifications. There are 49, I think, individual security breach notification laws. I don't know what state this is, but we don't have a federal level security breach notification law. So when you are a Equifax and you have a data breach and it affects all 50 states, you have to basically comply with 49 different laws in notifying people. And somehow we've not gotten the steam to actually pass a federal level law. So the CCPA, because it is requiring a great deal of compliance by California or anybody doing business in California, and other states are threatening to pass the law, then we may see action on the federal level. But of course, then we're concerned about preemption. We're concerned about the fact that any law that gets passed on the federal level preempts what typically in California are stronger protections that are in other states. Not universally true, but usually we pass the most consumer-friendly laws in the nation. Again, not universally. So it is sparking that conversation. And the thing you raised about nonprofits concerns me, because I think if we do look towards federal privacy legislation, we do need to be concerned about just exempting nonprofits the way we have so far, because they're engaged in the same types of data practices that everybody else are these days. And I think I find that really concerning as a privacy scholar, that we point the finger at the large corporations, but again, political parties, and right, you give it to the Red Cross and you're going to start getting solicitations from everybody else. I mean, to some extent, that's not necessarily different from the pre-digital world of mailing lists. And certainly we know a lot of those companies traded names prior to the internet. You subscribe to one magazine, you get magazine offers from other companies.
Scale and ability to correlate data from different sources.
Yes, but yeah, it's that the game has changed considerably, and were it just the simple, really the replication of what we had 25 years ago. I gave the Red Cross, and now I'm getting, American Lung Association. The fact that it's not just that simple, that they can now target you based on, what they think your income is, where you live, and so many other factors. That's a game changer. And so I share your concerns about that on a federal level.
So it goes back to this fundamental question, if I may ask.
Sure.
Is there a constitutional right to privacy? Like, I was in India, and there's been a lot of debate going on about the biometric Aadhaar and where it can be used and all. And the government is saying you have no right to privacy. And the Supreme Court has come out and said you have right to privacy in certain areas, and the government is refusing to comply. And we can see the example these days that the government is refusing to comply, even if you have a law on the books. So is there anything in the Constitution that guarantees a right to privacy? And some of those interpretations are pretty old because you didn't have all these technologies. So what's really happening in that area?
I'll give you a quick answer. Just to preface, I am not a lawyer nor a constitutional scholar. Don't take what I say as legal advice. Definitely. We do not have an explicit right to privacy in the federal constitution. In California, we do have a right to privacy in our California constitution. And I think on one level that makes it simpler for us to pass these data protection laws in California, because we can point to the fact that we have a constitutional right to privacy. At the federal level, it's inferred, and it's inferred and based on Supreme Court precedent. So it's trickier because while we would like to maybe there are people who would like to pass an EU-style regulation like the GDPR. In Europe, you have a right to privacy as an EU citizen. That's it's part of the Declaration of European Human Rights. It's clear. So you can you can point to that right when you pass a law, whereas in the US, we can pass federal level privacy laws, but there are instances where you're going to run into First Amendment concerns around privacy, and I don't know enough about that area deeply enough to really get into it, plus I don't want to take us wildly off track.
Yeah.
But just to say that in the laws that we have so far at the federal level are all based on consumer protection, which is very different from human rights. And so we don't have a human right to privacy the way they have in the EU. So anything we do at the federal level is going to look a lot different, most likely, than what they have in the EU, because we don't have that. I mean, we'd have to do a constitutional amendment potentially to give us, some explicit right to data privacy, for example. And because we treat corporations as people in the US, and I don't want to say this is the only reason, but because of that, there are things that we might want to do in the privacy space that corporations can argue infringe on their First Amendment rights, just to lay that out there. So it's not so simple, and because anything we do is going to be in the data protection or the consumer protection space, whatever laws or whatever agencies we even potentially create are going to look different than what we have in the EU.
Yeah, so I know a lot of the people in the audience are faculty and staff at Stanford as well as students, so I wanted to kind of tie the direction of the conversation around your background and maybe getting some advice on what are some good ethical data strategies that Stanford faculty and staff and students, how can we help shepherd, including like nonprofits you mentioned, shepherd, big data sets, how should we ethically manage those type of risks before we disclose personal data to like another party or another external.
So first, the questions are great, so thank you. I just want to acknowledge that. Next, so everything I'm going to say comes out of my past experience, which has been all at Berkeley. This is not a Stanford Berkeley rivalry I'm trying to incite, but just to say that before coming to Stanford, I was at Berkeley, and so all of my experience is Berkeley based in kind of the academic research context. So I think there are a few assumptions I would make, and I have not yet put a study through the IRB here at Stanford, so I don't have any firsthand experience of the process, although I did try to dig into it a little bit before our talk here today. And I think I would say a few things. One is that I think there are a lot of assumptions around collecting data that we all need to potentially revisit or maybe potentially provide more education about on campus. There's a lot of assumptions around if it's public, I can collect it. And this could be anything from like research on Twitter, for example. Oh, people's public Twitter posts, I can just scrape those and do a study on that, for example, which may be technically true, and even if there's the issue of you're respecting their terms of service or breaking it, which I think is actually not a clear-cut ethical issue. There are times when I think the research agenda could potentially justify breaking their TOS, but that's a legal question that I would always take to the Stanford General Counsel potentially for the privacy offices to discuss. But again, I think there's often been an assumption that, if I de-anonymize the data, or I'm just scraping Twitter posts and I won't have Twitter IDs, for example. Like we make these assumptions about data and whether it's publicly or privately available, or that we've stripped it all of all identifiers and that it won't be re-identified, and we can just go on our merry way and publish these things or release data. And I would caution against making those assumptions, essentially. We are at the point now where you can collect so much data, both publicly and through multiple venues, that it's become harder and harder to be able to say with confidence that you have de-anonymized data. It's easier to actually re-identify data than people, I think, assume. And so
Do you think it's like a losing battle with all the AI and machine learning advancements that really re-identification is just inevitable?
not necessarily, not by definition. However, I think that researchers need to be much more educated and aware that just because you did something, you're following procedure that you've done for the last 10 years and you think that, oh, well, I didn't include people's first names in the data set, or I removed their zip codes. It doesn't mean that it's not re-identifiable. We also need to really, I think, look critically at using methods like differential privacy. I think there are potentially, and I don't know this for sure, but I believe there are government agencies that are beginning to rethink, for particular studies they fund, whether they require tools like differential privacy. The US Census is using differential privacy this year, and that means all the research consumers of US Census data are going to have to basically understand what that means in terms of the data and how they analyze it, and understanding what effect it has on the data set. But the census, I hear, is committed to doing this because they feel like census data is too easily re-identifiable, and that they have to
With the zip code.
use differential privacy. And just to say, on the very most simplest level, differential privacy is injecting noise into a data set. It's the most simplest definition. That instead of, like, if you take my record, for example, let's say it's a demographic record, it has my name, my address, my zip code, my gender. Maybe you have a program that goes through and like puts in a different zip code for me, or a different age. So it's like randomly, potentially changing different fields in the data set so that it becomes harder to re-identify people, but depending on the size and the data involved, it wouldn't necessarily affect the outcomes of your analysis. It would horribly skew your sample towards more men than there actually are, because it depends on how many factors you have in data points, but that's the most simplest way I would describe it.
Got it. And like, in terms of like, traditional or even new, like what are some good privacy, security, hygiene, design practices that you've seen either at Stanford or at Berkeley, that
Sure.
or even at corporations that you think we should do to try to protect consumer data?
So I would say first and foremost from a research context, use encryption. And actually as a personal thing, use encryption. If you're using an Apple laptop or desktop computer, that's a very trivial step. I haven't owned a Windows machine in a long time, so I don't recall how easy or hard it is. I don't remember if even encryption is built into Windows at this point. But if it's available to you, do it. It is.
It's easy on Windows 10 these days.
Okay, good.
For professional, but not for us.
Great. So, that's one of the simplest things you can do. I myself had a laptop stolen when I was a student researcher, and it was encrypted, and therefore I did not have to fill out a breach report and potentially notify everybody I collected data on that I had a security breach, because the data should have been unrecoverable. So encryption is kind of a no-brainer, but that's for everybody. If you're an employee, personally, if you have equipment at home or you're a researcher, absolutely, do not do research on any kind of device that leaves the building and have it not be encrypted. In terms of research too, I would suggest walking through, and this is something I think that might need to be changed at the IRB level. I was digging into this a little bit, and it's not clear to me at Stanford that we actually force researchers to do this. But trying to answer the questions around what are you going to do if your data is breached? What process are you going to follow? Who's going to have access to it? Where are you storing it? Where are you collecting it? In the past, we were asked things at Berkeley like, where physically is the computer going to be that the data is being stored on? Is it going to be in a locked office? Will it be in a file cabinet? Today, almost everybody's collecting data in an online environment. So making sure that you're using something that Stanford at least has approved. You don't just go to Amazon, you use cloud services or
Stanford.
You need to use an actual Stanford approved vendor. But that's a big one for students, I think, because a lot of times you're like, oh, I'll just do a survey in Google Forms, and great. Like on my personal account, not even on my Stanford account. And that's fine, right? No, it's not. And certainly questions are, again, around access. Who has access to it? And also, how long you keep it for. So I understand actually in the research context here, you have to hold on to your data for 3 years for campus purposes, but after that it's up to the researchers to delete it. You can hold it indefinitely, and you can make the argument, I need to never delete this data, but I think in most research studies, that's kind of a hard thing to argue, that you can dispose of the data after a 3 or 5 year period. And I find even personally, the housekeeping around that can be hard. When I finally left Berkeley, when I graduated almost 2 years ago to come here, I actually forced myself to go through all my research studies and say, do I need this data anymore? No, I'm delete a database off a web server. Like I went through all those steps, but I had to do it myself and I had to remember to do it. And that's, I think, one of the biggest goals is that, you do this research study, 5 years goes by and you don't remember where you put the data. You forgot you had it on a web server somewhere. So those are some of the research hygiene practices I would suggest.
It's really helpful. And, you talked a little bit about IRB and, some of the research, issues around research. Do you see any new best practices around informed consent, and as researchers are, interacting with your potential human subjects that you think we should consider?
Yes. So consent is a really favorite topic of mine, and consent is really one of the things at the heart of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. For those of you who are nodding their heads, everybody's heard of Cambridge Analytica. I'll take a moment just to talk about that. So just as a good example of how we should no longer do consent. So the researcher that kind of kicked off that study, I mean, you can place blame on Facebook to some extent for creating the platform and the permission that allowed Alexander Kogan at University of Cambridge to collect the data that he could, because he was able to collect data from 80 million people, I think, and only 20 took it. No, it's much smaller, really
Right.
small number.
It's like 50,000, I thought.
Yeah, it's
Something like that.
yeah, it's in the thousands or 100,000s,
Right.
but he did on
He leveraged it into a zillion.
Right, and that's because of something called friends permission, which was if you added his app to your profile,
Right.
it exposed all of the data of everybody you were friends with, and they had no idea that you had added that app. So that's what made this process spiral out of control. But the thing that he used to fall back on was the fact that he said, well, I got consent. And what he did is he put up a standard notice form, the type of thing that we're all used to clicking through and ignoring, at the very beginning of the survey, where in the fine print, he basically said, I'm going to take your data and sell it. Now, that actually was a violation of Facebook's terms of service and not one I would support. But didn't matter. I mean, he used that basically as an excuse to say, well, I got everybody's consent, so what's the big deal, right? And we all know that consent is one of the biggest lies on the internet. Like, nobody reads terms and conditions, nobody reads privacy policies. This is an area I study for many reasons, but most of which that these things are not designed for you. They're designed for lawyers. They are not consumer friendly. And certainly when you are deciding to do something, you want to add an app, you want to, join a new service, you are usually never in the mindset to actually stop and have to think through all of these issues that may or may not affect you today or even tomorrow. It's, the whole consent process is set up around stop what you're doing and think deeply about what you're about to do and try to foresee all the future consequences, which we're just, as humans, we're terrible at. And we don't want to, quite honestly. So just to say that by relying on that mechanism, which may or may not have been okay from the point of view of an IRB, but ethically I'd say it was extremely very deceiving. He was able to move forward, collect the data, and then he sold it to Cambridge Analytica, which also was both not allowed by Facebook's terms of service and potentially still not allowed by his research role. Just to say that I think a lot of times when we do research studies, we tend to try to just do the same thing. We put up the consent form. They're also really long and verbose. They're not very informative. It's different if you're doing a study in person and you can walk through somebody and talk to them about it. But in the online context, we tend to do the same thing that Facebook or Google or everybody else does. And so we need to move away from that. I don't have an instant solution as to where we need to go. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit. So insofar as the current environment, we could certainly do a lot better with the way these forms are designed, the language they use, the point at which we ask people to consider them. I mean, there's a lot of good research out there with excellent suggestions of how to fix the current situation. But the longer-term solution, too, is to move away from a system where you essentially have to make all these decisions and sign your rights away. And so that's where we get into the bigger questions around right to privacy, federal privacy legislation. Did you have a question about that?
Yeah, so coming back to the Facebook example, 50,000 people gave actual consent, but
Right.
then all their network got roped in.
Right.
And I'm seeing that this is a standard with apps. They scoop your entire contact list,
Yes.
and I have no control over what my friend gives away.
Right.
So it's a real issue.
It's a real issue.
And where does that figure in? That, companies cannot collect data from the contacts of the person who actually can give activities.
It's a big issue across a lot of contexts. One of the areas I study is direct-to-consumer genetic testing. And that's an even more perplexing area of you decide to get your DNA genotyped at 23andMe or Ancestry.com. You didn't ask your kids or your grandparents or your parents, but you have now included them in that database, and you've made them potentially identifiable in the future. To me, that's like the ultimate vexing example that I'm grappling with right now. Something like contacts is trickier because you have a right, well, not right, but you have an address book. Do we want to disallow your ability to use the contacts you have to potentially find other people? I mean, it would be nice if people could electively say, don't do that to me.
So it's like, somebody is getting an incentive, refer 5 of your friends and they give away my personal information. Or LinkedIn scoops up your entire address book.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
And many apps are constantly stealing data from your contact books, and it's all uploaded and nobody even knows it.
So I think there's a couple different dimensions. One is I would say there's a difference between giving away somebody's email address, which at this point, email addresses are fairly cheap in that most of us can get another email address. I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying in terms of the damage, as opposed to giving out a social security number, which is obviously a lot harder to replace, or your DNA, which is even possible to replace. Versus platforms where the whole architecture is built on gathering data both about you through things like your address book or your camera. Smartphones that, it's only been in the last few years that the smartphone platforms have changed, where that you can tell an app, no, I'm not giving you access to my address book. No, I'm not giving you access to my photos. When all these platforms launched, now about 10 years ago, that was the fault. All that data was just basically supplied without you. Your only decision was whether to install the app or not. So there's been some progress on that level, more by Apple, I would say, than Google and Android. Although I think on Android too now you are able to tell apps, no, you can't have access to this part of my smartphone. But there's also the bigger question of why should using a smartphone make me vulnerable to data collection by a host of other entities that I have not given permission to? So that's the third-party data collection issue. And that's the one I think will be very contentious as we can work through what future laws may look like. The CCPA, for example, doesn't deal with that. It doesn't stop that data collection. And one of my personal concerns with this new California law is your ability as a consumer to make requests to those companies that are potentially tracking you in the background on an app, on a website. You should have those same privacy rights that you have with Facebook or Google, but how are you going to learn about them? How do you know that Flurry, which is an analytics company, has a profile on you based on your smartphone usage? So those are some of the weaknesses I see with the California law, and those are some of the areas I think we'll see a lot of fighting about as we move forward, are the ability of app developers and also just the entire kind of architecture that we've created around tracking, whether we're going to allow that to continue or if we're going to be able to actually make a substantive difference on those issues. The GDPR may be making some difference, mostly because information under the GDPR cannot be collected about you unless you opt in. You have to allow it to happen versus opt out. Now there's some interesting questions around the consent mechanisms and the opting in, but one thing that's important to know with the GDPR, it's been in effect for a year, but the DPOs, the data protection organizations on a country by basis are still taking in, still evaluating the complaints that people have made under the new law. And so we're just beginning to see some of the DPOs issue rulings on things like, in Germany last week, they issued a ruling on pre-checked cookie banner boxes. And I don't know if anybody here has traveled to the EU or where you have to always give cookie banners. Every website you get to asks you, do you accept cookies? So the Germany DPO basically said, you can't pre-check those as yes. You're gonna, so you could look at it two ways. One is that, great, now I have to go and check it before I proceed. Or maybe they need to rethink how they're even asking you this question and give you the ability to decline, which I've seen very few websites do. So those are some of the things we're hassling through. And I can, yeah, do you have a question?
That was actually going to be my question was, you had said something about not penalizing people consumers for not wanting to opt in. So there's not like two uses of an app where you only get some functionality.
Right.
But currently isn't that the state? Like you actually have to accept in order to be able to use things fully. So will the CCPA is the right mechanism to handle this kind of thing?
I don't think so. It's more about you exercise the rights. So you ask them to delete your data or you ask them to not sell your data and they can't then, as a customer, they can't charge you more, essentially. And that was, I think, the key concern that led to that provision was, okay, if it's a free service and I tell you I want you to delete my data, but then I keep using it, which is the uncertain part to me. You can't then price discriminate against me. You can't say, oh, well, fine, I'll delete your data, and but now I'm going to charge you for this service. I'll charge you more.
So on that note, I had like two questions. I know this was like a ballot initiative that just kind of became a law, right? So can you just in a nutshell go over kind of the narrative of how that happened and like what they were trying to accomplish like with this ballot initiative, like who was driving it? And again, I know the toothiness of the law is like obviously not there, but just like a quick background.
Yeah, so it's an interesting group. It was really spearheaded by one person, a real estate developer named Alistair McTaggart, and a few other people who joined him in creating a kind of nonprofit. And it was, as his story goes, it was based on him having dinner with a Google engineer who he asked, what do you guys know about us? And the shorthand was everything, which he found disturbing. And he had the resources, as this is California. We have the open ballot initiative process, which means that anybody who can raise enough money or self-fund enough money to get the signatures to get a ballot to get something on the ballot, can do it. So he was motivated enough to put the money behind it, and I think he got other donations as well, and they got the initiative on the ballot. And as the deadline, so there's a deadline in California by which point the ballot initiative cannot be withdrawn. Or you can withdraw it, well in this case what the offer on hand was, please withdraw the ballot initiative, because what happens is when you pass a ballot initiative, the ability to change it is really difficult, which is why something like Prop 13, we passed in 1979, not everybody is happy with Prop 13, but because it was passed by ballot initiative, you can't just simply, I think, overturn it in the legislature with a simple majority. It's, I think you have to either go back to the voters, or you need I don't think you need a super majority. Other people.
2/3.
Yeah. So anyway, as I understand it, the companies, Google, Facebook, others, saw the CCPA ballot initiative coming down the line and basically said, stop. Went to the legislature and said, please, reason with these people, let's make it a law instead of a ballot initiative, because if it goes, and it will probably pass, Alistair's organization has claimed, 90%, opinion polling on the topic, that there was basically no doubt that it would have passed in November at the polls, that they instead went to Alistair and basically tried to work through a compromise. And why he gave up the private right of action, for example, in that compromise, I do not know, and I hopefully will have a chance to ask. But at any rate, he withdrew it from the ballot, or his organization withdrew it, and it became a extremely rushed, into the night legislative process that has been criticized as having been extremely exclusionary. Like most of the usual people at the table, the ACLU Northern California, Consumers Union, who does consumer reports, and other kind of progressive groups that tend to look at privacy as part of their bailiwick, were not included in that process. So that's been some of the biggest criticism about it, plus the obvious, large removal of the private right to action. Does that answer your
Yeah,
question?
thank you. So New York Times has a great article on this. Okay, yeah.
They
Why
do.
they withdrew and.
They do. They wrote out the one woman who was involved in the passage of the bill, unfortunately.
Do you have any predictions on part two? I mean, Alistair's at it again, right? So what are you hearing?
Yes. I, in fact, am going to learn more about that later today. And I don't know. I just read a very brief skim of what's involved. I actually pulled up the proposed bill. It's 50 pages. I did not have time to read it before I came to talk to you guys today. But it looks to be a lot more comprehensive in its scope. It'll be interesting because, again, they're right. People are really energized around privacy, at least the public is, and I'm sure it's polling at the same level that the original one was. I don't know if there'll be any confusion. It's hard when you're, this is my research life, to know how much the public understands about some of these issues and how aware. So if we have another ballot initiative come up, if people will, what happened to the first one, or
Who resolves the conflict?
who resolved what
So
conflict?
if a new one passes,
Between the two laws.
Who's gonna, who does the reconciliation?
That is a good question. I would think the Attorney General's office would
Oh,
probably go
great.
through a period of
Wonderful.
saying,
That doesn't sound good to me.
these two things conflict. There's some very good people working at the DOJ. So I would not say that with cynicism.
I would.
Okay, fair enough. But the brief summary I saw of the new proposed law, it looks to be much more targeted on information types. So things like location data, medical data. I don't know how that would conflict with HIPAA at a federal level, but yeah, so much broader and probably more extreme. I don't know if it includes a provision to create a data protection organization, but that's something that's come up both in discussions at the federal level as well as the state level. Do we need a DPO, essentially? The FTC at the federal level, taking into account they're under-resourced, under-financed, is still a data or a consumer protection organization with all of its power basically invested in the court system. So we're asking judges, ultimately, to make decisions around privacy and privacy laws. And there's a lot of criticism, I think, about that rule, especially because a lot of judges tend to adhere to the idea of privacy harms as having no meaning unless they're economic, which in a world of free services, how do you quantify that? And I would say most people tend to agree, no, even if the harm isn't physical, I'm not bleeding, or I haven't lost money, we feel there are harms to us by the fact that our data is, sometimes it really is an economic harm because your data is compromised in a breach. And you can say somebody stole my identity, like there is a direct harm there. But the sense that we're being harmed because of these intangibles. These companies know a lot of information about us. I would say one of the most insidious ways that we are harmed that is really difficult to track is through the lack of information, meaning that Google knows who you are, and you therefore, or even Facebook's actually in trouble for this. I know that you are, I'll say me, female, in my 40s, I live in the Bay Area, I live in Berkeley, that I get ads targeted to me or not targeted to me. So one way in which Facebook is being sued right now is by the Housing HUD, Housing and Urban Development, for housing discrimination, because advertisers could place ads on Facebook to exclude people they didn't want to rent to. So,
Or for jobs.
and jobs,
This also
absolutely,
came out
yes,
that
this is
women
another
were
one.
not shown job opportunities.
Right, as a
People
woman, I don't
above
get to
a certain
see,
age were not.
there are job opportunities that are just not shown to me or my age, right? So that's a harm, but it's difficult to prove because
But
it's an absence rather than a presence.
this is the whole problem. Even with antitrust law, they are saying, with these Amazon and other services, they are saying actually the prices are going down, so you can't prove it's not harm. But there are other types of harms. So our laws are antiquated to deal with.
There was a whole event here at Stanford on that topic last Friday.
So now we talked a lot about some bigger issues, and I just wanted to kind of help us close and give some of the Stanford community some quick takeaways, or any quick takeaways that you think we, as a Stanford community, where we can control some of the efforts to help protect consumer privacy, what would be the top 2 or 3 things we should think about as we move forward in our work?
I mean, there's always the personal, what can I do, right? And I hate to sound depressing when I give out advice on those topics because it's tough. You can't reasonably tell people anymore, well, just don't go online. You can't. It's not possible. I mean, how do you apply for a job? Does anybody write out paper job applications anymore? Like, it doesn't happen. So, I mean, everybody, almost everybody has to have some online presence, especially people in very vulnerable positions in society. I mean, food stamps in California, I believe, are online. There are other forms of aid that public, agency aid that's totally online, and so you need access to the internet and to digital services. So I think one area that you can personally try to make some impact is with your smartphone usage, and part of that's just the being skeptical about what apps you use. You don't necessarily have to read everybody's privacy policies. You don't have enough time to do that anyway. But certainly being skeptical about what apps you use, considering turning off certain settings on your phone, like location settings, Bluetooth settings. This is especially true in public places. And if you're on an Apple device, the new iOS 13, I think, actually is making some substantial changes where you'll be notified anytime you're in an area where somebody's trying to use your Bluetooth radio to basically help target advertisers for your location, which is kind of a game changer. I mean, it's maybe not an ideal solution in that as a user, you're going to get these notifications and what do you do? It'd be better if you just simply, the data wasn't collected. Instead, you'll probably have to make the choice. Do I turn off Bluetooth? Why isn't Bluetooth off by default? Or why don't they make it easier to turn these things on and off? So there's still a lot of things that are pushed down to you having to make a choice, but I would say there are things you can do. Some of the more typical things like use, I would consider using Firefox as a browser. Firefox has made some really strong inroads around the types of tracking that's allowed by default, preventing it. So checking defaults. Anytime you use any type of new system, the defaults are usually set to maximal data exposure. I was doing kind of an informal study on smart speakers, and that was certainly true. If you choose to use a smart speaker in your home, which I would say please don't, but if you do, making sure that you go through the configuration and that you don't have things set to default. In terms of what we can do in terms of the Stanford community, I think, I don't want to repeat everything I said around the research area, but I would say in terms of, this is a campus that has obviously given birth to some pretty amazing companies, and companies, some in particular, that now have an oversized presence in our lives. And so I think as a campus, there's a few things we could do. One is like really trying to emphasize questions of ethics in terms of our educational process. I don't know who has the power in the room necessarily to do that, but certainly if it's true, the numbers I've heard that our undergraduates are 50% computer science across campus. I don't know if that's actually true, which just seems mind-boggling, that it's half the campus. There should be a solid ethics education for those students in terms of trying to understand how tech and society and values interplay. And certainly I think too, as if you're staff thinking through, if you're in charge of like signing contracts or thinking about vendors, all those things all have data implications. And so I know at Berkeley, when we moved to the Google suite of services for email and docs, my colleague who's a lawyer, Chris Hufnagel, actually went line by line to that contract and went back to the general counsel and said, take this stuff out. Like we're not giving this over to Google. So exerting that power, I think, as an institution and making sure that when we do contract with vendors and we bring services in to help us, that we are really scrutinizing those services and making sure we're not just handing over our data without thinking about it. I think I'd stop there.
So considering so many Stanford alumni are behind this privacy breaches in terms of the companies they set up, is Stanford taking a stance against those alumni, like not taking their contributions, donations.
I would say, from my experience.
Not inviting them to campus and, eulogizing them as super gods and feeding them at the campus. There
My
should
sense is
be
that
some
this
public,
campus is not.
disapproval expressed. But I don't see anything of this sort.
Right. I agree, it's a complicated
And
issue.
unless that happens, the message won't get across. I mean, if you bring somebody ex-Stanford, person and honor them, give them the Entrepreneur of the Year award, and they're also breaching privacy, then, the university's ethics itself is at,
Right.
questionable.
And I think that's where having a discussion around ethics is going to be the key, especially in terms of how we educate students on ethics. And do we continue creating entrepreneurs that go out and create systems?
But
That,
that
wait a
is
second,
5
let's
years
be
down
sure.
the road. I'm
Hold on.
talking about the administration.
I'm gonna close up the meeting because I think the next speaker is here and will want us to talk, but we can take this conversation offline to the back. Thank you guys so much.
thank you.
Thank you.